refresh my memory on why you're on hotel Wi-Fi?
Oh, I'm in Austin, Texas at the the first annual, aka inaugural, EntreArchitect Annual Meeting. So it will become an annual meeting from here on out, and this is the first one. So I'll be speaking here tomorrow, talking about disruptive technology in architecture and you. And so far today, we're 1 day into the 2 day conference. It has been a fantastic lineup of speakers. And surprisingly, for the first time for this conference, I don't think anything's gone wrong, which is awesome.
Oh my goodness. Hold on. Gotta knock on that wood.
Yeah, knock on the wood. Yeah,
Don't jinx
exactly.
yourself, man.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think hiccups would be expected, and definitely like, you know, not a big deal. But none of that's happened, so it's been fantastic. Yeah, and first time in Austin, so I have not been to downtown yet. I don't know if I'm going to get there. Kind of out of town at this lake slash resort place, and right on the water, and it's beautiful, and so hopefully I'll get to come back with the family at some point and check Austin out for real. But I don't think I'm going to have time this trip.
So you won't put the weird in keeping Austin weird?
Right. Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Just keeping it
That was
peripheral.
bad,
Yeah. Good job there.
but well, I have been, sadly I am not there, but I have been paying attention to the tweets and Facebook posts and such, and I see that a couple of friends have been speakers so far. So
Yeah. And there's a
America,
lot of
yeah,
friends in the audience too. Awesome to see, to like put some names to some faces that you maybe only see online into real life, and that's been really cool. And then obviously catching up with other real people folk that we know throughout the years of doing the podcast and connecting through that community has just been fantastic. So super cool to see people like America and Mark and a lot of friends here today.
yeah, it's really amazing that that's sort of how like that network started is essentially through social media. And the more and more we meet friends, the more and more we meet people, when you roll from like a conversation that you've had through Twitter to then meeting them in person, almost all the time that I've done that, me being a weird kind of loud introvert, I don't know what you want to call it, but been able to like almost just roll into a conversation with them like we've been having a conversation for years. And it's just that's the level of comfort that community has created, that people just feel like they belong. And that's kind of really cool about what that community has really done for the architecture community.
And I think it's because it's been around before all of these social media cesspools became what they are today, right? I mean, the people who are in these communities are there for the right reasons, right? They're not just there to tear everybody else down and talk about their problems. And so it really becomes a place of support and, I mean, accountability and sharing and all those things that actually do help the profession. So yeah, it's an amazing community, and it's obviously due to kind of the original folks who helped create that community on Twitter and in the Facebook group for EntreArchitect. I mean, definitely like some major achievements have happened. I think, a good way to consider it, because it really has helped the profession. It really has grown to a huge community, which is awesome. So it's really cool to see them kind of branching out into new ways to connect in person, and be it the first one is just it's fantastic, because again, like it still feels kind of fresh when there's like a new avenue to get together and experience other people's company and insight and sharing, like the way that people are sharing, it just continues at this event. It's not just like a get together to pat each other on the back, right? It's one of those places where it's continual learning all the time. There's some Mark said that every single person that he has to speak at it said yes. So, I mean, that was my response. Hey, do you want to speak at this thing? It was just yes. I don't even know when it is. I don't know where it is. Yeah, I absolutely want to be a part of that for sure. And it's because of the caliber of people who have come to this community throughout the last 10 years. I think started in December of 2012, Yeah, it's been going strong ever since. So pretty cool.
Amazing. Yeah,
I
that's
know.
awesome.
Yep. So I have a quote to read. I have a quote to read you. You ready for this? This person said, I need to do more of that because it was refreshing to see architecture or architectural view through other people's lenses. That was you. You said that.
I was going to say that sounds familiar. Like,
So,
is
to,
there other people out there that are thinking the same thing as me?
yeah. So what is that in reference to, and what did you get to experience that led to that quote?
So I have been recently kind of feeling a little isolated from the office and just like, professional discourse in general. And so, I've just started to look around and see, what kind of events are going on around the area, and went to a local library who was doing a speaking engagement or a book reading, I guess we can call it that, for this local author, Jeff Morrison, who has written a couple of different books. And specifically, he was talking about his Guardians of Detroit, and he was talking about architectural sculpture in the Motor City. And so, what was interesting about this is, so he's presenting and talking about sculpture that you've seen on buildings. A lot of it was kind of focused around the early 1900s, but then it, also kind of like talked about this evolution from this architectural adornment from, the early 1900s as it kind of evolved through, the pre-war, post-war, and then to kind of almost win architectural adornment, the sculptures that kind of occupied buildings and cornices and corners and entryways and all this other stuff kind of disappeared. And but he was looking through it first. So he's got two books. He's first looking through the lens of the city of Detroit and all of these architectural sculptures in the city, and then also his other book was Guardians of Michigan, and is basically talking about other places outside of the city, the city proper itself. So where that quote that you came from was that at first I thought, oh, this is kind of cool. A local architect is sharing his vision of, these things that sort of go unnoticed in, just architecture. I mean, because, we look at the building, but we as architects kind of look at buildings and we see all of those little details. We see, gargoyles or friezes or cornices and things like that that are just, kind of beautifully architecturally adorned. You don't really think about it, and so as he was giving his introduction, I had no clue that he was not only not an architect,
Hmm.
but he wasn't even an architectural historian. It was an interest of his that, yeah, he researched the books, he researched the buildings, he researched the sculptors, he researched the methods. I mean, he researched all sorts of things. So he became an architectural historian by default of presenting the book and presenting his work, but he was just kind of a hobbyist photographer that started taking pictures and started to realize that his eye kind of gravitated towards, these like adornments on the buildings. And he started to look and say, wow, I've got a lot of like pictures of just all of these little, these things on buildings that people rarely ever notice. And it just became an obsession a hobby that became an obsession that became a book.
That's
And
super interesting.
what was amazing about it is it talks about, kind of this collaboration between artist, architect, sculptor, builder, and how there was this symbiotic relationship between them early on that really doesn't kind of exist today. And it was just really kind of interesting. And there was a couple of buildings that he had talked about, like the Guardian building in Detroit, that was funny enough now is like the headquarters for Smith Group. or at least the Detroit office of Smith Group. I don't know if that's like their main office, but they designed the building back in the 1920s and now occupy the building.
That's cool.
He was talking about this building, and it's a high-rise building. I think 32 stories, but he was talking about how quickly it was built. It was built in 18 months and all of these other things. And but you look at the building, you look how like absolutely gorgeous the building is, and all of the different details of the building, the sculptures, and the mosaic tile work, and all of these other things that are about this building. And me wrapping my mind around like the process of today and thinking that they built this building in 18 months. And I was on a tour of that building one time, and you could tell who was architects in that group and who wasn't architects in that group. And
On the tour itself, you mean? People doing
on
the tour.
on the tour,
Yeah.
you could, well, the person giving the tour, who was definitely an architect, but you could tell in the crowd who was an architect.
Right.
Maybe because they were probably possibly dressed in black.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Right.
But it was more so because when he was rattling off facts of the construction budget and the time that it took and the design time that it took and everything else, and where all of those materials were coming from, like Turkish tiles and Italian marble and all of these other things, that were shipped from Italy, and you think about all of the things that went into making this building. And then they say 18 months. And when they said 18 months, every architect in that room jaw dropped,
Yeah.
because they're like, what the hell? I mean, it was, and so, and as he was talking about it during this lecture, somebody at the very end, when they were doing Q&A, they had happened to mention, or they had asked the question. They were like, hey, just curious today, how long would it take to do those buildings, or do those sculptures or whatever, and can you? And he was just like, well, that's not what I do, but it would be really interesting. I was standing in line to buy one of his books and to get it signed and to just chat with him and tell him how much I appreciated the lecture. And so the lady who had asked the question, I'd started to talk to her. And I was just like, it was interesting that, and I told her the story about me going on the tour. And because all of the architects who you could clearly see their jaw dropping kind of like gathered together, and we were all talking about, how much it would have, like our estimates of how much it would have cost, and if you could even do that these days, because of like the lack of craftsmen and all of this other stuff, to do that, or would it have been just done in like a plaster mold rather than carved, or would it have been done out of like fiberglass or whatever. And so we were talking, and then it was weird that like a bunch of other people like started flocking to me as I was having this conversation, and then they started asking me questions. As I was like, I switched from just like having a brief chat about the question that she had to like somewhat holding court about architecture and everything else. And we were talking about, like this, my notion of like, preservation through poverty, trademarked. Don't anybody steal that.
That's going on a shirt.
and but we were talking about things, and it was fun to no one other than me in that audience was an architect. And it was amazing because it was an architecturally, like slanted book and, talk and everything else. And it was funny because like, as the author was like signing things, he was like listening in. And then when I finally got to, the front, you just kind of like picked up the conversation. He was just like, oh, I heard this. And he's like, well, what do you think about? And it was just this kind of like beautiful, like role, or like this shifting the conversation from like me having this weird little like court moment where I was like, people were asking questions about architecture and I was answering them, which is so funny because I'm like the most non-architect dressing architect, because I was wearing, of course, flannel because that's what I do. in jeans and hiking boots and just, how I normally dress. And they're like, you must be an architect. And I was like, yeah. And they're like, oh, and then of course, it was weird because then they're like, well, where do you work? Like a firm in Baltimore.
Yeah.
And they looked at me like, what are you doing here? Which was
I,
an interesting
I
cover.
just drove in for this lecture.
Oh yeah, exactly. But I definitely want to like put a link to it. It's basically guardiansofdetroit.com, and the author he was so like just amazingly engaging, but it was so where you were going is like this is being able to see like the connection, the shared history that he was presenting with everybody who was in this. Because I think I may have texted you when I was in there that I was like the youngest person in the room.
And you're not young,
Like,
Cormac. I'm just
and
going
I'm
to
not.
reiterate this for everybody right now
Thanks.
who thinks you are. You're not.
Yeah, I'm not young. And but it and so a lot of them had like this emotional or historical kind of connection to a lot of the places that he was showing. And so they would be like, oh yeah, my mom used to take me. It was like he was showing this one building and some of the sculpture. Unfortunately, the building's gone, but it was like the old Hudson's building in downtown. And Hudson's was a department store in downtown Detroit. Funny enough, where my parents met. And so everybody had like this shared history of all of these different places and stuff. And it was kind of cool to like see the way that it was presented in a very architectural manner, but in a very not boring architectural manner where you could connect to it and you could, and people were so excited about the places that he was showing and the buildings that he was showing and just the sculptures that he was showing. And it was good and refreshing to be able to just sit there and and especially me being new to the area, that was sort of why I wanted to go, is because I just wanted, I want to learn more about where I now live.
Yeah.
And what was great about it was just that everybody was very into it and very connected to it. And come to find out that I didn't actually have to drive 45 minutes to the western suburbs, because in a couple of weeks he's going to be at the local library here in Grosse Pointe. So I'll probably have to go again.
It's really cool to hear that there's like an appetite for design and architecture and kind of, the intersection of this craft that, of stonework and all those things that are totally a thing of yesteryear, right? Like these are not modern things. We don't see these on like we've talked about on recent episodes, like the buildings now are an output of like a direct relational output to the software that they're designed in. and there's no like stone entablature like plugins anymore, or gargoyle plugins, and that, although there might be some business in that for old places like this, but that's super interesting to hear that there was like an audience there who wanted to hear about. Like I would think, again, like to reinforce what you were saying, these are things that a lot of people just don't notice because they're just it's like seeing, the fire beacon on the side of a building, or a speaker in the ceiling. It's like they just kind of blend away, right? You don't really notice them because they're not like part of the main volumes and surfaces and materials, and your mind just kind of filters them out. But these were a huge part of, and what I'm interested to hear is, like, in his lecture, did he talk about like the meaning behind those things?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah, most certainly. And so he kind of broke it down into building usage and how that architectural sculpture had responded to the building use. And so it was the one that I found really interesting is when he was talking about publishers, like newspaper publishers and those kind of buildings. And so there's this interesting kind of connection to, not only to like Gutenberg, but then it would, went all the way back to like early written history. And it pulled in either authors or printers or writers who, have been known to like, be like the carrying on the spoken word to then the written word to then the published word. but they were all represented in the sculpture that was, on these buildings. And, and the same thing when, he went through a section on banking buildings, and, he was talking about like the Greek god of commerce, and how that was represented on the building, and things like that. And now we do things, probably a little bit more gestural, or kind of, it's a little, if you look at a building, oh, so, sorry, I'm gonna kind of like diverge here. I remember this conversation that a professor of mine had with the class when he was talking about how, most buildings nowadays need this kind of almost like pink neon sign that says, I'm a bank building, or I'm a publisher, or because they're so kind of devoid of the character of what they're being built for.
Mm.
And that just reminded me, as I was, talking about this, that we sort of have somewhat divorced the use of the building from the building itself. Now, I won't say that on everything. I mean, because you and I, came from public works and schools, and you really can look at those buildings, and you really do feel like, hey, that building, that school building looks like a school building. And maybe in this particular case, well, what was really interesting is, who Albert Kahn is, right?
Yeah.
So Albert Kahn actually is sort of known as like the architect of Detroit, especially during, its golden years of development, because Albert Kahn was, he designed Detroit, he does. And so even though like he worked with like very similar, either the same or similar sculptors as part of like the expression, you could see that the building itself, even if it did have sculptures on it that said, hey, here are our sculptural representations of, the use of the building itself still felt like it was a publisher or a bank, or, a hospital or whatever, because there was something about it that the character, the assemblage of like parts and pieces, made it feel like it was what it was. And, it's interesting now, because sort of wonder if we lost that little bit of like almost like self-expression to just kind of be a little bit more homogenous.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's basically what modernism is, right? It's stripping of ornamentation. And it is on some level, I don't think, again, like it's hard to say like there's this one criteria that fits all that fall under that category, because of course that's not true. But for the most part, I think it is kind of sterile in that way. And I would think, something that I notice non-architects say is how certain types of buildings that should not feel commercial. They feel like institutional buildings or commercial buildings, even though they're not. So it could be a small business. It could be someone's residence. You see some, like, I obviously spend a lot of time on Zillow right now, and you see some houses like pop up in the feed, and you're like, is that a house? It doesn't even look or feel like a house. And again, I'm just looking at photos, but I think you know what I'm talking about, right? It's like the international style and modernism started to make residences in this example feel more like institutional spaces, right? Just because of the oversimplification of materials and architectural language. And it's not to say that there are obviously very successful versions of those things that did go that direction, right? I can think of many that I've been to that like Schindler did or Neutra did, right? Where it's like very stripped down, but it still feels like a home. And maybe that's just because I'm an architect, though. I don't know. Like it is interesting, I think, to look through these other lenses, like you're talking about, of other people who are not architects as they kind of interpret or read architecture.
The great thing about those examples that you gave is that there was there was a sterility to some, when you like stripped it down, they stripped it down to, almost minimalism, and it was just kind of void of like, the personality came from the people who occupied it, not from the building itself. But what I find really interesting about like Neutra or Schindler is that it wasn't necessarily kind of like necessarily overly pushed on it, but there was still a character of warmth and inviting that just made those, in my opinion, far more successful modern residences than.
Timeless. Yeah, timeless for sure. Because yeah, you're absolutely right. They weren't totally sterile, right? They weren't devoid of feeling, right? They because they were masters of light and shadow and like the size of the space and the quality of all of those things as you were in them. And I think you're right. You're onto something there. It's like it is kind of this environmental feel that they were able to achieve that you don't see in quote unquote architecture in a lot of cases today, where it is very much about economy, right, and efficiency. And you see like the use of materials purely in the name of economy and efficiency, right? And it's like we're not like this goes back to that Heatherwick article that we discussed earlier about building 40-year buildings versus 1,000-year buildings, right? Like that the materials that we're using are commodity type building materials and they're not going to last. Like they are going to have to get swapped out at some point. And it's just, there is a complete lack of ornamentation unless it's like cove molding or whatever whatever you want to call it. It's like particle board that you buy off the shelf in Home Depot to create some crown molding at the top of the room. It's like people think of that as ornamentation nowadays, right? And it's just totally application. It's like the worst form of what we're talking about here. Whereas there's not, I mean, there might be some craft involved in the creation and installation of it, but the materials are not going to stand the test of time. It is purely like to cover up other kind of mistakes that perhaps lie underneath where we have to apply these trim because they cover up the way that the wall meets the floor, for instance, right? So it's interesting because like when the buildings like the facades like the ones that I'm sure that you saw in the slides or in the conversation that are referenced in the books are very much like they're a part of the architecture, right? Like they're not just decorative. Like they're there for more meaningful reasons. They're done with craft and quality. They stand the test of time. All of these things just take it to that deeper level. That and yet still they fade into the background. That's kind of interesting as buildings pop up over time. It just dilutes the overall visual aesthetic of the city. And you might catch a glimpse of those every once in a while, but for the most part, they're just background and because there's just so much in the city that it's hard to kind of people to pick that stuff out. But when you see it, it's like when I tune into it and I love taking pictures of that stuff because you just don't see it anymore, right? It's never new. It's always this old stuff that is kind of decaying and it's got stains on it. And it's really interesting though, because it's different than anything else that you see.
This book actually, and I was starting to allude to it, really started to show this kind of like the evolution because so there was a predominant sculptor that had worked with both Albert Kahn and also I guess we can call it the early stages of Smith Group. I think the main designer was of the time was Wirt Rowland. Yeah, Wirt Rowland. And he, funny enough, for 12 years was the chief designer at Albert Kahn's office. And then later he left them, for I guess a little bit more creative freedom from out from under the thumb of old Kahn to basically become the lead designer for what is known as Smith Group. And what was really interesting about that is because his career tied closely to these buildings that worked with this architect, I mean with this sculptor, and might as well say it's Corrado Parducci was the sculptor, an Italian American sculptor. Technically his name was Joe, but Corrado Parducci was, he was a sculptor in New York, and then they, started doing some work with him, and then he, essentially he started to do more and more and more work in Detroit, where he essentially basically just relocated to Detroit and became like, the sculptor of Detroit, just like Albert Kahn was like the architect of Detroit. But but what you can see is the evolution of architectural languages from, like almost like this Italianate, Renaissance to this kind of, the evolution of like Art Deco and Art Moderne, and even into some more modern, before like, this decoration was stripped from, the more modern buildings. But you see this evolution from, these beautiful carvings to, like carved reliefs to, almost like cast sculptures and things like that. So it was interesting that, you can almost do like this charting of architectural style through the way that the sculpture was, presented. Even, if you put a blinder on and you didn't look at the actual building itself, but you looked at the sculpture on the building, you could say, oh, well, that is this kind of that style of building, or this style of building, because it was just really interesting. And to be quite honest with you, I probably wouldn't have even noticed this if it wasn't for looking at these buildings through the lens of the sculptures, through the lens of just a guy who was really, really interested in looking at those, looking at buildings, not just necessarily the buildings, but the sculptures that went with the buildings. And, it was just like, it was really interesting that we spend so much time looking at the details in our own work that sometimes, those details kind of like pass us by, and it takes, looking at it through the lens of somebody else to kind of like reintroduce you to it, or introduce you to it for the first time. I mean, because necessarily teach the old ways and the old things, other than, oh yeah, this happened back here, but here's how we do it now, kind of thing. And really, there's so much that can be taught by the older styles, even if you aren't going to like, even if you're not in kind of like this, preservationist or classical type, approach, you were able to like look at how they did like an entrance, and and see how that translates to like what you're doing.
Yeah, I think of it kind of like this class that I mean, obviously there, we had architectural history class, but I also had a class in college called music appreciation, right? And it's kind of like that, if, as far as architecture goes in this sense to me, because I'm a big fan of modernism, like that. If I practice a style of architecture, it is that one. And the idea of ornamentation at this level is not something that I'm interested in doing, but I do appreciate it. I think the closest that the thing that I guess I would say translates well to the modernist style is something that you would see, I guess, like something at Falling Water that you see in the fireplace, right? Or some of those kind of bas reliefs that you see on buildings like Billy Chen and Todd Williams do, where it's like some of their partie diagrams are cast into concrete, and then those are placed in buildings, and it becomes kind of an Easter egg hunt on some level. Maybe it's not like a whole wall, but it might be a piece that's kind of tucked away on the side that kind of gives like some meaning to the architecture of maybe where the idea where it came from, that's been kind of cast into the building itself. I really do appreciate those kinds of things, and I find them extremely interesting. And yet they're still kind of different from the types of things that you experienced in this lecture and in the book.
It's kind of enriching in a way. It's, rewarding to see that people do appreciate. And yes, this was more, traditional, or I mean, more historical architecture, but it was still to just kind of know that people actually do appreciate the work that you do. And we may not hear it all the time, or we rarely ever hear it, especially like in groundbreakings when we're always standing in the back and they say, we would like to thank all of these people. And you're like, wait, who are those people? I've never seen them day one in meetings or anything. And they're up there patting themselves on the back for the work that, we and many others have done.
The ceremony of the uninvolved, yes.
The ceremony of the uninvolved, yes. But then when you really see that, like, we do it because we hopefully that we're enriching the built environment, And when, people who, and even the library that we were at was this, he would have totally dug it. It was this very cool modernist kind of library that, um, as you drive up to the library itself, because it was more of a modernist, and it was in the evening that the lights were on, and it was kind of highlighting the books. And so as you drove up, it was basically the facade of books. It was just so cool. It was just a real, I wish I would have gotten a picture of it, but I mean, it was just like this really cool gestural kind of like nod to what we do. And so, those are the kind of like hints that, maybe we don't have to put a sculpture on there to let people know what the thing is, when we do other moves. But now I'm starting to ramble.
Well, I
So,
like the idea of some third party doing an interpretation for meaning of whatever the thing is, right? So this idea of doing that for architecture for a group of who's interested, I think that's a really interesting thing. Like it's kind of like music, right? It's like there are a lot of bands who write songs and do not specifically tell you what the song is about. They allow the listener to interpret it for themselves. And that happens through art. It can also happen through architecture, right? Just because somebody is interpreting it doesn't mean they're right, but it can be people can pull meaning from their experiences, from their studies of these different buildings and spaces. And I think what's so interesting about architecture, especially in the modernist era, is like it's not being spelled out for you. It is abstract, right? And so for those things to not be spelled out and for people to find meaning in them and and be able to interpret it to mean something is all positive, I believe. And to me that is something that architecture does for people, right? And that's what makes it meaningful. So for you to drive up to a building and maybe there's like some level of abstraction about this idea of the books, maybe not, maybe it's super literal, but the idea of what goes on in that building I think does kind of come back to what we were talking about earlier, that somebody's deriving some meaning of the function of that place and why it could be important, why it could be a cultural importance, why it could be something that's important to that community. Is I think that's something that is powerful within architecture, and it I mean, it's one of the big reasons why I like to do what I do in the architectural field, because I do believe that it does have an effect on our communities, and it can be a point of interest, amongst many other things. So yeah, it's really cool. Well, that sounds like super interesting. Was there any like interior stuff, or was it all exterior stuff, or was it a mix?
he mostly was dealing with the exterior. I mean, he did show a few interiors, especially some of like the more ornate buildings, but especially now, that some of these buildings are 100 years old, and they've evolved to a different use, and so a lot of the interior stuff might have been stripped away,
Mm-hmm.
and
Changed over time.
and so what you really see is, what's left is just the exterior stuff, and that was really kind of like fixed. And what was interesting too is because he would even talk about, like, like all these different like gargoyles, or like little sculptures and things like that were like these like little found gems along the building. And some of them, they was just like, well, why isn't this one, why isn't this facade, have the same kind of like attention? And so like, well, at this, it's even somewhat representational of what was there, because it's just like, oh well, up against this building was another building, the building's now gone, but but this is all you ever got at that, so it was just, it I love just like the little simple nods to back to the history of the city or the state at the time that these were built.
Yeah,
um,
yeah, totally.
and even sculptures that were representing of like, here's somebody from the city council who helped the funding of this building, and so they get a sculpture on the face of the building.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So it's so funny.
I can't really think of anything like that in the city that I live in, but there are mosaics done all over the city and actually like the neighboring cities too. that are really cool. And like they're on the bank buildings, like you're talking about the bank buildings and what bank buildings look like. And there's definitely like institutions throughout the city and like in certain locations in the city, like welcoming people to the city that are that's like our version of that. So it's very West Coast. It's obviously way later than the kinds of things that you're talking about happening in Detroit, or New York City, for example. But there are things like that in more modern cities that are just different, but still super interesting, and they've got a really cool history as well.
Yeah, because I mean that really does kind of like tie directly into kind of like this linear evolution of architecture. And like if you think about it, the more you move west, you start to see that where architecture started, like the height of architecture in say like Los Angeles or LA County, where you're at, and it's really it's we want to do something that's reminiscent of the people who might be moving here, but we're going to do it in our way, our fashion, in our language of modern architecture, modern of their time, not modern, but still sometimes modern. But it really kind of is like this is our take on that kind of things.
I
And
was just looking it up. Millard Sheets is the artist who did it, and if you, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But I mean, he did murals all over the country, but just incredible work, and I'm just lucky to have so much of it in my hometown here and local areas as well. I mean, there his studio is literally like a mile from my house, his original art studio, so it's very cool.
yeah, I think I've probably got a bunch of photos of that I took of your town with those very, kind of like just those sculptures or those kind of like reliefs or those murals or
Yeah, there are a lot of reliefs,
mosaic.
yeah, mixed with mosaics, and he did a lot of home savings and loan banks back in the, I would say probably during the 50s, and they're still standing today. They're incredible. So I'll put a link to that in the show notes because he actually taught at the local college in Claremont as well. So there was such a huge art scene here. So I think that this is the closest thing that I can get to what you're experiencing there in Detroit in my town. So pretty cool stuff. Well, you know how we talked about architectural injuries last episode? Like right after that, I broke my finger. I was like, did I cause this? What just happened? Crazy. I was at the climbing gym with my kids and I was just doing the normal thing that I always do, and my finger made the most terrible sound. And so I decided to go to urgent care because I thought I like blew a tendon or something. And because I looked it up, what do you do if you tear a tendon? It's like go to the ER. So I went to the urgent care and they did an X-ray, and yep, broke my finger. So once again, jinxed
And
jinxed myself with an Archispeak podcast. Jeez.
and especially since doing you were traveling, this was before you went to MDC,
Right.
before where you are now.
Yep.
And so,
Oh my God,
I
there's so
mean,
much handshaking going on, and it just kills me every time. I try not to shake anybody's hand too hard because I'm just like I'm not wearing the brace anymore. So this was I don't know. When did I do this? I guess I did it last Thursday. It's Wednesday now. It's been 6 days since I broke it, and I'm just trying to get along without this giant ugly brace on my finger, on my middle finger, on my right hand. So yeah, fantastic.
I honestly, if I were you, I would put it right back on just so that you don't like re-injure it from
I am
all the
a
handshaking.
little afraid of like slamming it against something. Yeah, sometimes. So
Like,
anyway,
hey, how
I
you
do think
doing?
I jinxed myself
You
having that
probably did.
conversation. Yeah.
And you are welcome
Thank you. For what?
because for it, I think I was the one who, well, you brought it up.
I
You
did.
started
I
this.
did. I did. So I welcome.
You're welcome to
I
yourself.
guess I'm welcome to myself. Yeah. So that's stupid. I should never do that again.
Not only do you suffer for your art, but sometimes you suffer for your hobbies.
That's right. Gotta. Yeah. Suffer everywhere. Suffer fest.
Just suffer.
Just suffer.
What are you going to do? Cry about it?
Nope. Not gonna cry
No.
about it. I feel pretty proud of myself because I didn't cry about it at all. My kids are like, "You seriously broke your finger?" Like, "Yep." It's like, "How's it going?" I'm like, "It's fine. Don't worry. It's not a bad break." So, yeah, felt pretty
Yeah.
tough.
Well,
Anyway,
you know.
well, next time we'll talk about Monterey Design Conference.
Yes.
Tell people what that
Excellent.
was like.
Looking.
We got a bunch of stuff to talk about there. Thanks for listening. This show is part of the Gable Media Podcast Network. See all the shows at gablemedia.com. That's GABLMEDIA.com. You can help support what we're doing here by leaving a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts to help get the word out, and don't forget to share it with your friends. We'd love to hear from you, so leave a comment on the website at archispeakpodcast.com, where you can find our entire catalog of shows. Talk to you soon.